The cabin looked wrong. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they rode past Henrik Larsen's claim in the autumn of 1879. It sat there on the Montana prairie like something that didn't belong, like a mistake someone had made and then left to stand as a monument to poor judgment. The other settlers' cabins followed a familiar pattern: simple rectangular structures with walls of horizontal logs, peaked roofs, a door facing south, maybe a window if the family could afford glass. They looked like cabins should look: clean lines, predictable proportions, the kind of building that said a man knew what he was doing. Henrik's cabin looked like no cabin anyone had ever seen. The walls didn't rise straight up. They leaned inward at an angle, creating a structure that was wider at the base than at the top. The roof wasn't a simple peak design, but rather a complex arrangement of different slopes and angles. Strangest of all, the entire structure was partially buried in the hillside, with earth piled against 3 of the 4 walls almost to the roofline. It looked like someone had started to build a cabin, given up halfway through, and then tried to hide their failure under a pile of dirt. The mockery started almost immediately. John Patterson, whose claim bordered Henrik's to the east, made it a point to bring visitors by just to show them the ugly cabin. "That's what happens when a foreigner tries to build American," he'd say, shaking his head. "Man doesn't even know how to stack logs proper." Sarah Mitchell, who ran the boarding house in town 25 miles away, heard about the cabin and rode out to see it for herself. She stood there for 5 minutes, just staring, before finally saying, "Well, I've seen some peculiar things in my time, but that takes the cake." What in heaven's name was he thinking? Even the more charitable settlers, the ones who didn't outright mock Henrik to his face, had their doubts. "He seems like a nice enough fellow," Martha Crawford told her husband. "But that cabin worries me. A man who builds like that, maybe his judgment isn't sound in other ways either." Henrik Larsen heard all of it. He was 38 years old, a Swedish immigrant who'd spent 5 years in the copper mines of Michigan before filing his homestead claim. He was a quiet man, not given to explaining himself, and he certainly wasn't going to defend his building choices to people who'd never experienced a real winter, because Henrik had seen real winters. Growing up in northern Sweden, he'd experienced cold that most Montana settlers couldn't imagine. He'd seen entire villages cut off by snow for months at a time. He'd seen livestock freeze solid in their barns. He'd seen people die because their homes couldn't stand against the cold that came down from the Arctic. He'd also seen the buildings that survived those winters. Traditional Swedish structures that had been refined over centuries of brutal cold. Buildings that worked not by fighting the winter, but by understanding it, accommodating it, using the very earth itself as insulation. When Henrik looked at the typical American frontier cabin, he saw death waiting to happen. Single-wall construction that would leak heat like a sieve, peaked roofs that created dead air space but provided no thermal mass. Above-ground construction that left the structure exposed to every wind that blew across the prairie. So he built differently. He built what he knew would work, and he didn't much care what his neighbors thought about it. The construction had taken him all summer and most of the fall. He'd started in late April of 1879, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. The first month was spent excavating. He'd chosen a south-facing hillside with good drainage, and he dug into that hill, creating a space that was half buried, half exposed. The excavation was 12 feet deep at the back, gradually sloping to ground level at the front. The floor of this excavated space was then lined with a thick layer of gravel for drainage, topped with flat stones that he'd hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away. This stone floor took him 3 weeks to complete, but he knew it was essential. Stone held heat, stone stayed dry, stone lasted. Next came the walls. But these weren't walls in the conventional sense. Henrik built thick posts from pine logs, each one sunk 3 feet into the ground and rising 7 feet above. These posts formed the skeleton of the structure, spaced 4 feet apart around the perimeter. Between these posts, he built double walls. The inner wall was made from split logs, fitted tightly together and sealed with a mixture of clay and fine sand. The outer wall, 3 feet away from the inner wall, was made similarly. The 3-foot gap between these walls was filled with a mixture that Henrik had carefully prepared. Layers of dry prairie grass, clay, more grass, then a thick layer of earth, then more grass, then more clay. This wasn't random stuffing. Each layer served a purpose. The grass provided insulation through trapped air. The clay provided a moisture barrier and added thermal mass. The earth provided weight and stability. The total thickness of his walls, from inside surface to outside surface, was nearly 4 feet. 4 feet of insulation where his neighbors had 8 inches of wood. The roof construction was even more unusual. Henrik built a frame of heavy logs, then covered it with a layer of split wood planks. Over this went a thick layer of birch bark, which he'd stripped from trees and dried during the summer. Over the bark went a layer of sod, cut from the prairie in thick blocks and laid like bricks. Over the sod went another layer of bark, and finally over everything another layer of sod, this one seeded with native prairie grasses. The roof, when completed, was nearly 2 feet thick and weighed several tons. The structure beneath it had to be massively overbuilt to support this weight, which is why Henrik had used such large posts and beams. But that roof, thick and heavy as it was, provided something no conventional roof could: thermal mass, insulation, and integration with the landscape. When snow fell on Henrik's roof, it didn't slide off. It stayed there, adding another layer of insulation. The growing grass on the roof helped hold the soil in place and provided additional insulation through the air trapped in the root system. The entrance to the cabin was another innovation that drew mockery. Instead of a simple door, Henrik built an entrance tunnel. A person had to duck through a low opening, walk through a 5-foot-long tunnel with earthen walls, pass through an inner door, and only then enter the main living space. This tunnel served as an airlock. Cold air, being heavier than warm air, would sink and stay in the tunnel. Warm air from the cabin wouldn't escape when the door was opened because the tunnel trapped it. The design also meant that wind couldn't blow directly into the living space, no matter which direction it came from. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly spacious. The excavated and bermed construction meant the interior was 16 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. The walls, being buried or bermed with earth, stayed at a nearly constant temperature. The stone floor, once warmed, held that heat for hours. But the centerpiece of Henrik's design was the fireplace and heating system. He didn't build a conventional fireplace against one wall. Instead, he built what he called a tile stove, a massive structure of mortared stone and clay that stood in the center of the cabin. This stove was based on Swedish designs that went back centuries. The firebox was relatively small, surrounded by thick walls of stone and clay. But the smoke from the fire didn't go straight up and out. Instead, it was forced to travel through a series of channels built into the stone mass, winding back and forth up and down, before finally exiting through a chimney. This meant the smoke gave up almost all of its heat to the stone before leaving the building. The stone, in turn, radiated that heat slowly into the living space. Henrik could build a hot fire for 2 hours, and the stove would stay warm enough to heat the cabin for 12 hours or more. The entire structure weighed over 2 tons. It took Henrik 6 weeks to build, hauling and placing each stone individually. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Why build something so massive, so complicated, when a simple stone fireplace would do? By the time September arrived, Henrik's cabin was finished. The other settlers had completed their cabins weeks earlier and were already breaking ground for spring planting. Henrik was behind schedule, behind budget, and the subject of constant speculation and mockery. That Swedish fellow with his mole hole sauce, people called it. The ugliest cabin in Montana, some said. A waste of effort, others agreed. Henrik didn't argue. He was too busy preparing for winter. While his neighbors assumed the mild autumns they'd experienced for the past few years would continue, Henrik was cutting firewood. Cords and cords of firewood, stacked carefully under a covered area he'd built attached to his cabin. He was also laying in supplies: dried meat, flour, beans, salt, everything he could afford or make. He filled his root cellar, another excavated chamber dug into the hillside behind his cabin, with potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions. He rendered animal fat and stored it in clay pots. He dried wild berries and preserved them in that rendered fat. His neighbors, seeing all this preparation for a winter that was still months away, shook their heads. "Acting like the world's going to end," John Patterson remarked. "Man scared of his own shadow." October arrived with unusually warm weather. Indian summer, people called it. Clear skies, mild temperatures, perfect conditions. The settlers worked their fields, hunted deer and elk, enjoyed the beautiful autumn. Henrik continued preparing. More firewood, more food. He checked every seal in his cabin, every gap in his walls. He tested his stove repeatedly, learning exactly how it drew, how much wood it needed, how long it held heat. He was a man preparing for war, and winter was his enemy. On October 23, 1879, the sky changed. Henrik noticed it at dawn, a thin high cloud layer moving in from the northwest. The temperature was still warm, almost pleasant, but something about that sky made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd seen that sky before. In Sweden, that sky meant one thing: a storm was coming, not a normal storm, a killer. He spent that day making final preparations. He brought all his remaining outdoor supplies inside. He checked his livestock, 3 chickens and a goat, making sure they were secure in the small barn he'd built against the hillside. He filled every container he had with water from the creek. He brought extra firewood inside the cabin itself, stacking it near the stove. His nearest neighbor, Patterson, saw him working and rode over. "What's got you so stirred up, Henrik?" he asked. Henrik pointed at the sky. "Storm coming." Patterson looked up at the thin clouds. The day was still relatively warm. That's nothing. Might get a little rain, that's all." "Big storm," Henrik insisted. "Very cold, soon." Patterson laughed. "Henrik, it's barely fall. We won't see real cold for another month at least. You're worrying over nothing." Henrik didn't argue. He just continued his preparations. The temperature began dropping that afternoon. By evening, it was noticeably colder. By midnight, it was below freezing. By dawn on October 24th, it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit and snow was falling. Not just flurries. Heavy, wet snow driven by a north wind that was gaining strength by the hour. By noon, 6 inches had fallen. By evening, a foot. The temperature continued dropping. 20 degrees below zero, then 30 below, then 40 below. The wind reached speeds that no one in the territory had ever experienced. 60 miles per hour, 70, more. The combination of extreme cold and extreme wind created conditions that were simply beyond anything the settlers had prepared for. John Patterson's cabin, built with single-wall log construction, couldn't stand against it. The wind found every gap, every crack. The heat from his fireplace was sucked away almost as fast as he could create it. He burned through a week's worth of firewood in a single day, and still the cabin stayed barely above freezing. By the second day of the storm, Patterson and his wife were in trouble. They'd burned almost all their firewood. The cold was penetrating the cabin despite their best efforts. Patterson's wife was showing signs of hypothermia, shivering uncontrollably, becoming confused. Patterson made a decision. They had to get to Henrik's cabin. It was only half a mile away. Surely they could make it half a mile. They wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they owned, tied a rope between them so they wouldn't be separated, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit them like a physical blow. The cold was so intense it hurt to breathe. The snow was so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet. They struggled forward, Patterson trying to navigate by memory and instinct. They should have covered half a mile in 10 minutes. It took them over an hour. They got turned around twice, wandered in circles, nearly gave up and tried to return home, but Patterson knew if they went back, they were dead. The cabin couldn't keep them warm enough to survive this, so they pushed forward, stumbling through snow that was already waist-deep in places, fighting wind that tried to knock them down, enduring cold that froze any exposed skin in minutes. When they finally saw the dim outline of Henrik's cabin, partially buried in its hillside, they could have wept with relief. Patterson pounded on the outer door with numb fists. Henrik opened the door immediately. He'd been expecting someone. He'd known his neighbors' cabins wouldn't stand against this storm. Warm air rushed out of the entrance tunnel, not just warm, hot. Impossibly hot compared to the frozen hell outside. Henrik pulled them inside, through the tunnel, through the inner door, into the main cabin. The heat hit them like a wall. After hours in 40 below cold, the warmth was almost painful. The cabin was comfortable, not just survivable. Comfortable. The temperature inside was at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The massive tile stove in the center radiated gentle, steady heat. The stone floor was warm underfoot. The thick walls kept out every bit of the wind and cold. Patterson stood there, dripping, melting snow, staring around the cabin in disbelief. This was the ugly cabin, the mole-hole, the waste of effort, and it was warmer, more comfortable than his own cabin had ever been, even in summer. Henrik didn't say anything. He just helped Mrs. Patterson to a chair near the stove, gave them both hot broth, and let them warm up. The storm lasted 5 days, 5 days of cold that didn't rise above 30 below, 5 days of wind that screamed across the prairie like a living thing, 5 days of snow that fell until the drifts were 10, 15, 20 feet deep. During those 5 days, others came to Henrik's cabin. A family named Morrison, whose cabin was literally coming apart under the assault of the wind. An elderly trapper named William, who'd been caught away from his camp and barely made it to shelter. A young couple, the Hendersons, newly married and terrified, whose cabin had no chimney and they'd nearly asphyxiated trying to heat it with an open fire. Henrik took them all in. His cabin, ugly as it was, had space. The partially underground design meant he could have 10 or 12 people sleeping on the floor and still have room to move. The massive stove, which only needed to be fired twice a day, kept everyone warm. The thick walls meant the noise of the wind was muted, bearable, not the constant screaming that drove people to madness in poorly built cabins. And Henrik had supplies, not luxurious supplies, but enough food to feed everyone adequately, enough firewood to keep the stove running, enough water melted from snow that he collected in the entrance tunnel. The contrast between Henrik's situation and everyone else's was stark. In their own cabins, these people had been fighting for survival, burning everything they could to stay alive, rationing food, watching their children shiver despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. In Henrik's ugly cabin, they were safe, warm, fed, almost comfortable. John Patterson, sitting by the stove on the 3rd day of the storm, finally said what everyone was thinking. "We mocked you. We called your cabin ugly, called it a waste. We said you didn't know what you were doing." Henrik stirred the pot of stew he was making. He didn't respond. "We were wrong," Patterson continued. "We were fools, and we were wrong. This cabin saved our lives." Henrik finally looked up. "In Sweden, we have saying, judge building in winter, not in summer." If you're learning something valuable from this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share forgotten wisdom and survival knowledge from history that can change how you see the world. Hit that subscribe button now. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 6th day. The wind died, the snow stopped. The temperature was still well below zero, but the sun came out. Brilliant and blinding, on the endless expanse of white. The landscape had been transformed. Snow covered everything, drifting in places to depths that buried entire structures. Small trees had been snapped by the wind. Anything left outside was buried or blown away. The settlers who'd sheltered with Henrik began the dangerous work of making their way back to their own claims. They had to see what had survived, what could be salvaged. Patterson's cabin was intact but badly damaged. The door had blown in, snow had filled the interior. Everything inside was frozen solid. The cabin had lost so much chinking that gaps were visible between nearly every log. It would take weeks of work to make it livable again. The Morrison family's cabin had partially collapsed. The roof had been crushed under the weight of snow and the force of the wind. It couldn't be repaired. It would have to be completely rebuilt. The Hendersons' cabin stood but was uninhabitable. Without a proper chimney, they had no way to heat it safely. They would have to build a chimney before they could live there again, and building anything in these conditions would be nearly impossible. Over the next weeks, as people struggled to recover from the storm, Henrik's cabin became a community center of sorts. Families would come to warm up after working in the brutal cold of their own claims. People would gather there in the evenings, drawn by the reliable warmth and the sense of safety. And they would ask questions. How did you know to build like this? Where did you learn these techniques? Could we build cabins like this? Henrik answered patiently. He explained about thermal mass and insulation, about earth sheltering and airlock entries, about the importance of proper heat storage versus just heat production, about building not for the average winter, but for the worst winter you could imagine. Some people listened and learned. Others were too proud or too stubborn. John Patterson fell into the first category. He spent that winter studying Henrik's cabin, understanding the principles behind every design choice. When spring came, Patterson didn't just repair his old cabin. He started over. He dug into a hillside on his own claim. He built double walls with thick insulation. He constructed a tile stove, working with Henrik to understand the principles of heat capture and slow radiation. His new cabin, finished by the following autumn, looked almost as ugly as Henrik's, but Patterson didn't care what it looked like. He cared that it would keep his family alive. Others followed suit. Over the next few years, several families in the area built earth-sheltered cabins with thick walls and tile stoves. The techniques spread, adapted, evolved. People combined Henrik's Swedish methods with other traditions and innovations, creating structures that were uniquely suited to the harsh Montana climate. But not everyone learned. Some settlers, particularly those who hadn't personally experienced the storm in Henrik's cabin, continued to build in the conventional way. They'd had cabins that survived the storm, after all, even if just barely. Why go to all the extra effort? These settlers would face their own reckonings in the years that followed, because the winter of 1879 to 1880 wasn't an isolated event. It was a warning, a preview of what Montana winters could be. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was worse, much worse. Known to history as the Great Die-Up, this was the winter that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the northern plains and destroyed the open-range cattle industry. The cold was relentless, the snow was deep, and poorly prepared settlers paid the price. Families froze in cabins that couldn't protect them. Livestock died by the thousands. The death toll among humans was never accurately counted, but estimates range from dozens to hundreds across Montana territory alone. Henrik's cabin stood strong. By then, he'd added on to his original structure, expanding the underground living space and building additional storage areas. He'd refined his techniques, improved his stove design, and increased his emergency supply storage. And once again, his cabin became a refuge. Families who'd ignored his advice after the first storm came back, humbled and desperate. Henrik took them in, as he always did. The contrast between preparation and unpreparedness was even more stark this time. Henrik had 2 years' worth of stored food, enough firewood to heat his expanded cabin all winter, and systems in place to keep himself and his sheltered guests not just alive, but relatively comfortable. Meanwhile, all across the territory, people were dying from cold, starvation, and exposure. After that second brutal winter, Henrik Larsen's reputation changed completely. He was no longer the odd Swedish fellow with the ugly cabin. He was the man who'd figured out how to survive Montana winters. He was the builder everyone wanted to consult, the neighbor everyone hoped lived nearby. Settlers came from miles away to study his cabin. He gave freely of his knowledge, never charging for advice, never hoarding his techniques. He understood that survival in this harsh land wasn't an individual effort. It was a community effort. When everyone built better, everyone was safer. Over the years, Henrik refined and expanded his original design. He added a second tile stove for cooking that didn't heat the cabin as much in summer. He built an attached greenhouse on the south side, using it to extend his growing season and provide fresh greens even in winter. He developed better systems for water storage, for food preservation, for managing livestock in extreme cold. He married in 1883 a Norwegian woman named Ingrid who'd arrived in Montana with a wagon train. She took one look at the earth-sheltered cabin and said it reminded her of home. They raised 4 children in that cabin, and those children never spent a winter night shivering with cold. By 1890, Henrik's homestead had become something of a local landmark. Travelers would make detours to see the famous underground cabin. Agricultural extension agents from the territorial government would visit to document his techniques. Academics from back east would write papers about his innovative, earth-sheltered design. But Henrik himself remained modest. He insisted he hadn't invented anything new. He'd simply brought old techniques from Sweden and adapted them to Montana conditions. The real credit, he said, belonged to the generations of Swedish builders who'd developed these methods over centuries of harsh winters. Still, there was one innovation that was purely his own. The combination of earth sheltering with tile stove heating and multi-layer insulation created something that hadn't existed before in quite this form. It was a synthesis, a bringing together of different traditions into something new and uniquely effective. The cabin stood for over 50 years. Henrik lived in it until his death in 1928 at the age of 87. His children inherited the property, and his eldest son continued living in the earth-sheltered cabin even as he built a conventional frame house nearby. During the brutal winter of 1936 to 1937, when much of Montana was locked in a cold snap that rivaled the worst of the 1880s, Henrik's now elderly cabin once again proved its worth. Henrik's son sheltered 3 families there when their modern, heated homes couldn't keep up with the cold, and their coal supplies ran out. The cabin was finally abandoned in 1949, not because it failed, but because Henrik's descendants moved to town. The structure stood empty for years, slowly being reclaimed by the hillside it had been built into. In 1967, the Montana Historical Society declared the site historically significant. By then, the cabin had partially collapsed, but enough remained to show its unique construction. Archaeologists excavated the site in 1972, carefully documenting the design and construction techniques. What they found amazed them. The walls, even after decades of abandonment, were still intact. The insulation, though degraded, was still recognizable. The tile stove, though cracked and weathered, stood solid. The craftsmanship was evident in every detail. A replica was constructed near the original site in 1998, built as accurately as possible to Henrik's original design using period tools and techniques. This replica is now a popular tourist attraction and educational site. Thousands of visitors each year walk through the earth-sheltered structure, experiencing firsthand how effectively it maintains temperature. Even in summer, the replica cabin stays cool, rarely rising above 70 degrees, even when outside temperatures exceed 90. In winter, with just occasional fires in the tile stove, it maintains comfortable temperatures even when outside conditions are well below zero. Modern building scientists have studied Henrik's design extensively. They've measured its thermal performance, analyzed its heat retention, calculated its R values, and thermal mass coefficients. What they've found is that Henrik, working with intuition and traditional knowledge, created a structure that meets or exceeds many modern energy efficiency standards. The lessons from Henrik's ugly cabin have influenced modern building practices. Earth-sheltered construction has seen a revival. Thermal mass heating systems, similar in principle to Henrik's tile stove, are increasingly common in energy-efficient homes. The concept of building for extreme conditions rather than average conditions has become a foundation of resilient design. But perhaps the most important lesson has nothing to do with construction techniques. It's about the danger of conventional wisdom, about the cost of mockery, about the value of learning from different traditions. Henrik's neighbors mocked him because he built differently. He built differently because he knew differently. He knew from hard-won experience what Montana winters could be. His neighbors knew only what they'd seen in a few mild years. They mistook recent experience for complete knowledge. When the brutal winters came, that difference in knowledge meant the difference between life and death. Before we continue with the final part of Henrik's story, I want to ask you to do something. If this content is valuable to you, if you're learning something that could matter someday, subscribe to this channel, share this video. This kind of historical wisdom is being lost, and it's our job to preserve it. Subscribe now. The story of Henrik Larsen's ugly cabin is ultimately a story about humility. Humility in the face of nature's power. Humility about the limits of our own knowledge. Humility about the value of wisdom from other places and other times. The settlers who mocked Henrik weren't bad people. They were simply ignorant. They didn't know what they didn't know, and they paid for that ignorance, some with discomfort and hardship, some with property and livestock, and some with their lives. Henrik tried to tell them, not through words. He was never much of a talker, but through his actions. By building the way he built, by preparing the way he prepared, he was trying to show them what was needed. Most didn't see it until it was too late. There's a broader lesson here about how knowledge gets lost and found. Henrik brought traditional Swedish building techniques to Montana. Without him, that knowledge might never have been applied to the American frontier. After him, it became part of the regional building tradition, adapted and modified, but still recognizable. But this transmission of knowledge almost didn't happen. If Henrik had listened to his neighbors, if he'd been swayed by their mockery and built a conventional cabin, his knowledge would have died with him. If he'd been less generous with his techniques after proving their worth, the knowledge might have stayed locked up in his one cabin. Instead, he shared freely. He taught anyone who wanted to learn. He never said, "I told you so," never used his vindication as a weapon. He simply helped people understand how to build better, how to survive better. This generosity had ripples that extended far beyond his immediate neighbors. The settlers he taught went on to teach others. The building techniques spread across Montana and into neighboring territories. Agricultural extension publications wrote about his methods. The knowledge proliferated, adapted to different circumstances, and combined with other traditions, but always traceable back to that first ugly cabin on the Montana prairie. Modern homesteaders and survivalists have rediscovered Henrik's story. There's been a surge of interest in earth-sheltered building, in thermal mass heating, in designing structures that work with climate rather than fighting it. People building off-grid homes in harsh environments often start by studying historical examples like Henrik's cabin. What they find is that old doesn't mean primitive. Traditional doesn't mean inferior. The builders of the past, working without modern materials or tools, often developed solutions that were elegantly effective. They had to. Their lives depended on it. Henrik's cabin, ugly as it looked, was beautiful in its function. Every design choice served a purpose. Every unusual feature addressed a real problem. The inward-leaning walls provided structural strength against earth pressure while creating a more stable thermal envelope. The buried construction used the Earth's constant temperature as a moderating influence. The thick walls stopped heat transfer in both directions, keeping cold out in winter and heat out in summer. The tile stove, perhaps Henrik's most significant innovation, worked because it understood a principle that many modern heating systems ignore. Stored heat is better than continuous heat. A conventional fireplace creates intense heat while burning, but that heat largely escapes up the chimney. When the fire dies, the heat is gone. Henrik's stove captured the heat from combustion, stored it in tons of masonry, and released it slowly over many hours. This meant he could burn hot, efficient fires that completely combusted the wood, producing minimal smoke and creosote. Then he could let the fire go out completely and still have heat for half a day or more. This efficiency meant he used a fraction of the firewood his neighbors required. Less firewood meant less time spent cutting, hauling, and splitting wood. Less time on firewood meant more time for other essential tasks, and less wood smoke meant cleaner air inside the cabin and healthier lungs for everyone who lived there. The economic implications were significant. On the frontier, time was the most valuable commodity. Time spent gathering firewood was time not spent hunting, farming, building, or preparing in other ways. A heating system that required only a few hours of firing per day versus constant tending was a massive advantage. Henrik's cabin also demonstrated the importance of integrated design. The earth sheltering, the thick walls, the tile stove, the airlock entrance, the stone floor, none of these elements would have been as effective in isolation. It was their combination, their integration into a coherent system, that created the cabin's remarkable performance. Modern builders often focus on individual high-performance components, super-insulated walls, or high-efficiency heating systems, or thermal mass floors. Henrik's approach was more holistic. Every element supported every other element. The mass of the stove was protected by the insulation of the walls. The insulation of the walls was supplemented by the earth sheltering. The earth sheltering was made possible by the structural design. Everything worked together. This systems thinking approach is something modern green building has rediscovered and named, but it's not new. Traditional builders like Henrik understood instinctively that a building is a system, not a collection of parts. There's also a psychological dimension to Henrik's story that's worth considering. Living through a Montana winter in a poorly built cabin wasn't just physically challenging, it was mentally exhausting. The constant cold, the endless battle to stay warm, the knowledge that any mistake could be fatal, all of this created tremendous stress. In Henrik's cabin, survival wasn't a constant struggle. Yes, there was work to do, feeding the stove, preparing food, managing supplies. But there were also hours of comfortable warmth, time to relax, time to think, time to be human rather than just survive. The families who sheltered with Henrik during the brutal storms commented on this. Yes, they were grateful for the physical warmth, but they were also grateful for the peace, for the sense of safety, for the hours when they could stop fighting and just be. This mental health aspect of shelter is often overlooked. We focus on thermal performance and structural integrity. But a home's ability to provide psychological comfort, to be a place of rest and peace rather than constant stress, is equally important for survival. Henrik understood this, perhaps better than he could articulate. His cabin wasn't just a machine for survival, it was a home, a place where life could be lived even in the harshest conditions. The contrast between Henrik's approach and that of his neighbors also highlights different philosophies of frontier life. Many settlers subscribe to a philosophy of minimal adequacy. Build the smallest, cheapest, quickest shelter that meets the legal requirements. Get it done fast so you can focus on farming or ranching or whatever your primary economic activity is. This approach made sense in mild climates or in economic systems where you could rely on supply lines and community support. But in Montana in the 1870s, it was a gamble. It assumed conditions wouldn't exceed what your minimal shelter could handle. Henrik's philosophy was different. Build for the worst case. Invest heavily in your shelter because your shelter is your foundation. Everything else depends on surviving the winter, so make sure you can survive any winter. This required more initial investment of time, effort, and resources, but it paid enormous dividends when extreme conditions arrived. The man with the robust shelter survived comfortably. The man with a minimal shelter struggled or died. This tension between minimal adequacy and robust overbuilding continues to play out in modern contexts. We see it in debates about building codes, about infrastructure investment, about emergency preparedness. Do we build for the average case or the extreme case? Do we accept occasional catastrophic failures as the cost of everyday efficiency, or do we overbuild to ensure resilience? Henrik's story argues powerfully for overbuilding, at least when it comes to survival fundamentals. When failure means death, adequacy isn't adequate. The physics of Henrik's cabin are worth examining in more detail. The earth sheltering provided several distinct benefits. First, it created a windbreak. The earth absorbed the force of the wind, preventing it from stripping heat from the cabin walls through convection. Second, it moderated temperature swings. Earth has significant thermal mass and, below a few feet of depth, maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round. By surrounding much of his cabin with earth, Henrik was essentially wrapping it in a temperature moderator. Third, the earth provided insulation. Soil is not a great insulator per se, but it's better than nothing, and more importantly, it provides mass. Mass resists temperature change. A wall with thermal mass will gradually warm up on a hot day and gradually cool down on a cold night, smoothing out extreme swings. Fourth, the earth sheltering dramatically reduced the surface area exposed to extreme conditions. A conventional above-ground cabin has 6 surfaces exposed to weather, 4 walls, a roof, and a floor. Henrik's cabin had essentially 1.5 surfaces exposed, the south-facing front wall and part of the roof. Everything else was buffered by earth. The airlock entrance was another clever piece of physics. Cold air sinks. By creating a tunnel entrance lower than the main living space, Henrik created a trap for cold air. When someone opened the outer door, cold air would pour in and sink to the bottom of the tunnel. It wouldn't flow upward into the main cabin. When the outer door closed and the inner door opened, only a small amount of cold air would enter the living space. Similarly, warm air rises. The warm air from the cabin would tend to stay up in the living space rather than flowing down into the tunnel. The airlock prevented the mixing of inside and outside air, reducing heat loss dramatically. The stone floor served multiple purposes. Stone has high thermal mass, meaning it can store significant amounts of heat. During the day when the stove was burning and the cabin was warmest, the stone absorbed heat. At night, when the fire was lower or out, the stone released that heat gradually, helping maintain comfortable temperatures. Stone is also a vapor barrier. It prevented moisture from the earth below from wicking up into the living space. Moisture is the enemy of insulation and comfort. A damp cabin is a cold cabin. Henrik's stone floor kept the living space dry. The multi-layer insulation in the walls created what modern builders call a thermal break. Each layer of material had different properties. The grass layers trapped air, which is actually an excellent insulator when it's not moving. The clay layers added mass and served as moisture barriers. The earth layers added weight and stability. Together, These layers created a wall assembly that was extremely resistant to heat transfer. Modern testing of replicas has shown that Henrik's wall assembly had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of approximately R45. For comparison, a standard modern insulated wall might be R20 or R25. Henrik's walls were roughly twice as effective at preventing heat transfer as a modern conventional wall. The tile stove was the most sophisticated element, and it demonstrates genuine innovation. The principle is straightforward: capture as much heat as possible from the combustion process before letting the exhaust escape. In practice, this required careful design. The stove's internal channels had to be sized correctly. Too small, and they'd restrict airflow, causing incomplete combustion and smoke backup. Too large, and hot gases would flow through too quickly without transferring their heat. Henrik sized his channels through trial and error, gradually refining the design. The mass of stone had to be sufficient to store meaningful amounts of heat without being so massive that it took forever to heat up. Henrik's final design used about 2 tons of stone, which modern calculations suggest was close to optimal for the size of his cabin. The stove's surface area was critical. Heat transfers from hot stone to air through the surface where they meet. By creating a complex internal structure with lots of surface area, Henrik maximized heat transfer from the combustion gases to the stone, and from the stone to the room air. The result was a heating system with an efficiency that would be respectable even by modern standards. Henrik extracted roughly 70 to 80% of the heat energy from his firewood, compared to perhaps 20% for a conventional open fireplace. This efficiency had cascading benefits. Less wood meant less time gathering it. Cleaner combustion meant less creosote buildup and reduced fire risk. The ability to let the fire go out completely meant better air quality and less constant tending. The long heat release cycle meant more stable temperatures and better comfort. Henrik's cabin, for all its unusual appearance, was a triumph of practical physics applied through traditional knowledge and personal innovation. The social dynamics around Henrik's cabin are also instructive. Initially, he was an outsider, a foreigner with strange ideas, building in a way that seemed wrong to his American neighbors. The mockery he endured wasn't just about his cabin, it was about his foreignness, his difference, his refusal to conform. But when crisis came, difference became advantage. The strange cabin was the safe cabin. The odd foreigner was the knowledgeable survivor. Suddenly, being different wasn't a mark of foolishness, but of wisdom. This reversal happened quickly, driven by the stark reality of the harsh winter. But it left lessons that took longer to absorb. Some settlers learned immediately and deeply, changing how they built and how they thought about preparation. Others learned more slowly, requiring multiple harsh winters before they fully accepted that Henrik had been right all along. And some never learned. There were settlers who continued building inadequate structures year after year, surviving through luck or just barely, refusing to invest in the robust construction that would have made their lives safer and more comfortable. This range of responses mirrors human nature more broadly. Some people learn from others' experience. Some need personal experience before they learn. And some never learn, stubbornly clinging to their assumptions even in the face of contrary evidence. Henrik never judged. He helped everyone who came to him, whether they'd learned from the first storm or the fifth. His generosity was unconditional. This made him not just a technical resource, but a moral exemplar, someone whose character was as worthy of emulation as his building techniques. The long-term legacy of Henrik's work extends far beyond his individual cabin or even the earth-sheltered buildings that copied his design. He demonstrated principles that apply far beyond construction: the value of learning from diverse traditions, the importance of preparing for extreme rather than average conditions, the foolishness of judging by appearances rather than function, and the power of generous knowledge sharing. These principles remain relevant in our modern context. We live in a world where climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, where supply chains that seem robust can fail suddenly, where assumptions based on recent history may not prepare us for what's coming. Henrik's approach, study the worst case, prepare robustly, draw on diverse knowledge sources, build in redundancy, prioritize resilience over efficiency, offers a framework for thinking about preparedness in any domain. The ugly cabin that saved lives during the harshest winters on record wasn't ugly at all. It was beautiful in its function, elegant in its integration of multiple design strategies, and profound in its understanding of how to work with nature rather than against it. Henrik Larsen brought wisdom from one place and adapted it to another. He combined traditional knowledge with personal innovation. He built not for appearance or convenience, but for survival. And when the ultimate test came, his approach was vindicated in the most complete way possible. People lived who would otherwise have died. That's the measure of success that matters. Not whether something looks right or conforms to expectations, but whether it works when the stakes are highest. The settlers mocked his ugly cabin. Then it survived the harshest winter on record, and in surviving it taught lessons that echo across time, lessons we would do well to remember. Build for the worst. Prepare when times are good for when times are bad. Learn from those with different experience. Don't mistake conventional wisdom for complete wisdom. Share what you know, and never judge a shelter by its appearance. Judge it by whether it keeps people alive. Henrik Larsen understood these things. His ugly cabin proved he was right. And the people who sheltered there, who lived when they might have died, carried that knowledge forward. Some through their own building projects, some through the stories they told, some through the simple fact of being alive to have children and grandchildren who exist because an ugly cabin on the Montana prairie worked when it mattered most. That's the legacy. Not just a building technique, but a way of thinking, a philosophy of preparation, resilience, and generosity. A reminder that sometimes the fool is the only wise man in the room, and that survival belongs to those who prepare for the worst while others plan for the average. The cabin may be gone, reclaimed by the hillside it was built into, but the lessons remain, carved not in stone, but in the survival of those who learned them. And passed on now to anyone willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to build not for appearance, but for function. Not for average conditions, but for extremes. Not for convenience, but for survival. Judge buildings in winter, not in summer. That was Henrik's saying. But it applies more broadly. Judge preparations when crisis comes, not when times are easy. Judge wisdom when it's tested, not when it's comfortable. And remember that the ugly cabin, the one everyone mocked, was the one that saved lives when the harshest winter on record came howling across the Montana prairie. That's a lesson worth remembering. That's knowledge worth preserving. That's wisdom worth passing on.